Cool, we all settled and we got pizza. Good. But yeah, so thanks for having me. My name's Bianca. I'm a technical lead at Software, and we're going to talk a bit about mobile accessibility today, specifically for me, from my background in the context of React Native. But a lot of what I'm going to be saying applies just generally to mobile apps as well. A little bit about the plan today. So we'll spend 25 minutes on a talk. I'll tell you a bit about getting started if you've not thought about mobile accessibility before, what kind of guidelines you should be following. I'll talk about making it part of your process, so ways to think about it day to day and include it in your reviewing and your testing. I'll talk about some lessons that we learned hands-on, because I think the tech is really interesting and really fun. And then we'll do a roughly 50-minute puzzle hunt with an interactive activity that you can do some learning on your own. All right, be happy? Cool. All right, I'm going to controversially maybe start with who I'm not. So I am not an accessibility specialist. I've not been trained in this for years and years. The reason I say this is that I am still learning myself. So if at any point during this talk you think, oh, actually, yeah, I do know a better way to do that, or during the interactive part, I am also keen to learn. So please do share it. That's also why I mentioned that I'm not someone who uses assistive technologies day to day, so that's not an experience that I can share with you. Who I am is a technical lead with React Native experience, someone with an interest in accessibility, so it's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the last few years, and someone whose team has learned some gotchas hands-on that I think are really interesting to share and talk about. So with that in mind, here's what to expect today. What you should not expect is for this to be how to do mobile accessibility 101. If you're hoping to just learn everything you need today, I'm sorry to disappoint you. What this is some lessons we learned while developing our last mobile app, starting a bit of a conversation on good accessibility practices for your app, as well as some, excuse me, as well as some ideas on how to integrate these into your development process and make them part of your day-to-day. All right, let's get started. So if you're like me and my team, roughly a year and a half, 2 years ago, you might be developing your mobile app and thinking, OK, well, we want to make this accessible. I'm going to assume that you want to make things accessible. I'm not going to give you the spiel on why you should do that. I think it's just the morally nice thing to do. If you want market data on why you should do it, you can find that on Google. There are plenty of resources. So you want to make an accessible app. What guidelines do you actually follow? What do you actually do? So can you give me a hands up if you have also done some web development? Loads of people. OK, keep your hand up if you've heard of WCAG. Again, quite a few people. So for those of you who didn't, WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's a set of really thorough guidelines on accessibility, basically. So they'll list really specific requirements. It has multiple tiers of there's multiple standards that you can satisfy, basically. It's really handy. It's a really great way to learn about exactly what you need to be doing to support web content being accessible. So you might say, is there a mobile content accessibility guidelines? And the answer is kind of, but it's in its first draft status, and it's based on WCAG, so you might as well just be using WCAG as well. So if you've done that before, happy news for you. It's the same stuff again, but implemented slightly differently. You might say, but it's web, and sure, but it covers a lot of things that are more typical in mobile. So it will talk about things like swipe gestures and tap gestures, which are more common on tablets and phones. And if you think about it, the boundary between web and mobile isn't that clearly defined, because when you build a website, it still needs to work really well on your phone anyway. So yeah, you'll be spending more time on this than you'd think. The other thing that I would say that's really interesting from attending a conference a couple of months ago is they are currently writing the third version of WCAG, which is really exciting. That's really new and cool. They're going to publish the first draft of it later this year and then finalize it over the next couple of years, I think. And what they're doing is they're actually shifting from being so web-focused to being more technology agnostic. So they're actually changing the name from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines to the W3C, which is the name of the organization that does it, Accessibility Guidelines. And they're shifting more from being technology-focused to being sort of user outcome-focused. So whereas WCAG 2 might say, 2.2 is the current version, might say things like, this input has to have a label, WCAG 3 might say, everybody needs to understand what this input does. And that might mean a label, or that might mean something else, depending on your technology. So yeah, read up on WCAG. It's really great. It's really thorough. Also, accessibility documentation for your tech stack. So if you're using something like React Native, they've done a lot of the translating into Android and iOS accessibility APIs for you. And you can read up on that. And then ideally professional assessment and user feedback, because we can sit here and talk about accessibility all day, but it's never going to be as useful as hands-on feedback from people who actually rely on this day to day. That makes sense. I'm going to take that as an opportunity to take a drink. All right, so how do we meet our goals? What actually are our goals? The goal is for everybody to be able to use all the features in your app, and also for it to not be a pain for them to do so. How do we make sure that happens? So you make it part of your process. You make it part of what you think about day in and day out. One of the things that I see quite often, that's quite common, is the big accessibility review ticket. You might be familiar with this. This is when you finish an entire project or an entire mini feature or an entire big feature or whatever it might be. And at the end of this huge array of sprints, you go, OK, let's test everything with accessibility in mind. And then it will write up and triage issues. And this has its place. I would keep this. I think this is good sometimes. The nice thing about it is you get a full picture of how everything works with things like screen readers or keyboard or big text in mind. And it's a snapshot at the end of your feature, which is really useful, because otherwise you might fix an accessibility problem and then break it further down the line and then miss that. So I would keep this. The con of it really is, if you've not been thinking about accessibility throughout this until this point, you're probably going to find a lot of problems. And then are you really going to have the time to fit those into your next sprint and fix all of them? Probably not. So keep this, supplement it with something that you think about more frequently. And with that, I'll come to some things that worked with us. Full disclosure, the first thing, I've not actually yet tried. I just think it's really interesting. So the first thing is linting. I assume that you're familiar with this. You can find various linting plugins for whatever type of code you're writing. And if, like me, you're using React Native, then there is a ESLint plugin that will just scan through your code and go, OK, well, you didn't put a label on this input, or you didn't do this, and it'll catch some accessibility gotchas for you at the linting step, which is really handy. Automated testing, so we did this. We're now onto things that I've actually tried and tested and can genuinely recommend. Automated testing, so CLI tools and end-to-end test integrations. What we've used previously that has worked quite well is RoboTest, which is part of Google's Firebase. So that will run some things for you automatically, like looking for contrast issues in your app and that kind of stuff. So it's really handy. I'd recommend it. And then another thing that was really useful for us is including it in what you think about whenever you do reviewing and testing. So we used review checklists. So whenever you opened a pull request, automatically you'd get a checklist added to it. And that might include things like, I've included screenshots and the designs or whatever, but it will also include things like that are accessibility focused. So I've ensured every interactive element meets the minimum size requirement. I've considered screen readers and large text and that kind of thing when writing this code and when testing it. And then both the person submitting the review and the reviewer can have that in mind as they go through, which is really helpful. And same thing for testing. You would have a testing checklist that includes the acceptance criteria of your ticket, but it will also include things like both automated and manual accessibility testing. So when I say automated testing, I mean Android Accessibility Scanner. So if you've not come across it, Android actually has an automatic scanner that you can use for accessibility. It's really handy. Again, it will detect some easy wins like contrast and button sizes and that kind of stuff. You can install it and run it on your phone. It's free. It's great. I'd recommend it. And then manual things like, OK, the person testing this ticket is sitting down with a screen reader and actually going through it. And the thing I would say with that is test on both iOS and Android. I'll come back to it in a second. Yeah, and that you apply this to every ticket that you work on, and it sort of means that you're feeding it into your process day to day. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, so let's talk about some things we learned in the process, because I'm a technical person and I want to talk about the tech. I think that's really interesting. So coming back to screen readers, I think they're a really popular topic when we talk about accessibility. They get a lot of attention, which I think is rightfully so, because they can be quite complex. So I mentioned that I'd recommend testing on both iOS and Android. And the reason I believe that is that particularly for screen readers, their behavior can be quite different. So one of the things that you see is the reading order is different on iOS and Android. What I mean here is for both of them, the reading order is top to bottom, left to right. But on iOS, it's based on the order of things that appear on your screen. Whereas on Android, it's based on the layout in your code. So if the layout of your code doesn't match the layout on your screen, then the screen reader might read things in an order that you don't really expect. You have to remind yourself that not everybody using a screen reader is completely visually impaired, so this might be confusing to them just because the order they can see doesn't match the order of the focus. But also, sometimes the order of things for the screen reader is really important. For example, we had an issue where specifically because of this, in our code, we had a terms and conditions button that was right after the pay button in the code, which meant that people could make a purchase without actually even being aware that there were terms and conditions that they should read, which obviously is not great. So keep those kinds of things in mind. Test on both devices. A few other small things that you could keep in mind are roles are different on iOS and Android. So what you typically see, if you can see that tiny little button at the bottom of my screenshot, the screen reader, if you've done your job right, the screen reader should say the name of the button and say button, because it is a button, and then they should know that they can interact with it. Those roles are different on iOS and Android. So Android has the concept of a list, for example, that it lists on the screen reader. iOS doesn't. So that kind of thing. Keep it in mind. Test on both devices. I would also say be careful not to interfere with voice control. So the APIs that screen readers and voice control use overlap, which means that, for example, if for some reason I wanted to change the label of that button so that the screen reader reads something other than the text in the button, I probably shouldn't do it, but if I did it, that also changes what you would have to say to VoiceOver to activate that button. So you'd have to say, tap the whatever's in that button, browse our records button. So if you change that label and it doesn't match the text content of the button, you're going to really confuse and annoy some people who rely on voice control. Well, I've been going quite fast. Does that all make sense? Any questions so far? All right. Cool. Another thing that we learned was to think design first, and oftentimes you end up feeding back some feedback from development on accessibility to your designers and sort of doing a few rounds of iteration. So for example, what you see in that screenshot is my entire phone. So one of the things that you can do in your accessibility settings, you can try this yourself, is put your text up to a really large size, which is what I've done. And then I put my phone in landscape mode. You should be able to use every app in both portrait and landscape mode, unless you have a really good excuse why it shouldn't be that way. So for example, for a piano app, you need the width of the screen to be able to see multiple keys of the piano. So that's a reasonable excuse why your app should only be in landscape mode. But generally, unless you can come up with a really good reason, you're expected to support both. So I've put my phone on really large text in landscape mode, and now the header for Accessibility Tune, which seemed totally reasonable when I first built the app, covers almost half of the screen. And the visually interesting stuff that is interactive is right at the bottom, and I actually can't see most of it. So what I would do here is I would take this back to our designers, and I'd say, OK, well, in this particular scenario with large text or in landscape mode, this layout is no longer very good. Could we change things? So you should be able to, in your code, learn what the size of the text is, what the orientation of the screen is. So what we've ended up doing quite a bit is changing the layout based on that. So you can have basically your own version of breakpoints in CSS, but not quite. The other thing I would say is supporting reduced motion. So you should be able to reduce your animations, disable your animations in your accessibility settings on your phone. That needs to translate to your loading spinners, not spinning, and that kind of stuff. And I would also touch on dark mode. So there's a bit of an ongoing online debate about whether dark mode is an accessibility feature or not. The current consensus seems to be no, not really. What I have learned through user research in the last years that I found really interesting is that particularly neurodiverse people find dark mode interfaces a lot easier to visually process. And additionally, different people have different vision requirements, and some of them will find dark mode easier to process. The problem that people often cite with dark mode is when you decide, OK, my app is going to be in dark mode, and that's going to be the default, and that's going to be the only option. Because then you're actually disadvantaging people with different visual impairments. So for example, people with astigmatism, I think, don't read white text on black background as well. So stuff like that. What you want to be doing here, what the ideal is you support dark mode, but you support it as an option, and you give the user the control of how they would like to perceive the interface. So support multiple color schemes if you can. Expo has something for this. There is also a high contrast mode, specifically on iOS, where you can have a different color theme for if users would like a higher contrast in your app. Yeah. Any more questions on that? Cool. Finally, a few other stray thoughts, a few other final lessons learned. Going beyond WCAG, so going beyond what's minimally required of you. One of the things that we learned was to think more about what's actually a clear experience for users. So I'll give you an example. If you have, what we had was an interactive button that said things like, a bus icon and then the name of a bus route, which a lot of the time they're quite long and quite gnarly, and then 400M. And to me, when I see that, that reads, that bus has that name, it's 400 meters away. But when a screen reader says bus icon, blah, 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 400M, that's not always as clear. And you can just change the label of that to say the whatever bus is 400 meters away. And that's immediately just a bit of a smoother, nicer experience. So things like that, just considering how the information is coming across and whether it's clear. Another thing is to keep learning. Technology is continually evolving. Accessibility technology is continually evolving. We tested really thoroughly for all the things we mentioned so far. And then we really patted ourselves on the back and went, we built a super accessible app. And then we got some feedback from an external organization. And a lot of the feedback we got was your app is actually really hard to use keyboard only, which made loads of sense because we'd never tested it with keyboards only at all. I've included some references at the end of the slide, one of which is about keyboard testing and switch testing, which I found really interesting. So yeah, if you chat to me afterwards, I can link you to the slides as well. And finally, always expect the unexpected. So if you noticed, the tagline of this event is process gotchas and exploding buses. So the reason it's called that is a couple of months ago, earlier this year, we got a really strange bug from a stakeholder who said, it's really weird. I opened the app and I had my screen reader on. And the screen reader told me the 192, or I don't remember what bus number it was, but let's pretend it's the 192. The 192 bus is exploding. And we said, what on earth are you talking about? We never put the word exploding in the code base. Why would it say exploding? We didn't do that. And we did some looking into it. And what it turned out is we were using the word expected. So if you opened the app, it would say the 192 bus is expected at 7:32. And then if you tapped on something else that opened a different screen at just the right time, you'd see a loading spinner. And then the app would announce loading. So if you timed it just right, you would get the 192 bus is exploding. So that was me. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry, I rattled on quite quickly. I'm quite excited to do the interactive workshop. Before we delve into that, and I'll set you up and run you through how to do that, we've got a few people to help. I'll be hobbling around to chat and give a hand. Software people, could you give us a wave, please? The people who just waved with the lanyards are also here to help, and we'll also know how to help you with the workshop as well. Cool. Before we do that, any questions? Yes, hi Luke.
Did you fix the exploding bus?
No, I don't think that we did. I think we just said, that's really weird, sorry, don't do that.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, it just provided me with entertainment. But
a little Easter egg you meant to put in there.
Anyone else? Yeah?
With the hands-on testing, did you have people who use screen readers and things like that do the internal testing?
It was internal testing, it was just us. But what we did afterwards, the thing that I mentioned with the keyboard, is we had an external, I think the client organized for an external body that specializes in accessibility to audit the app as well. And that was really insightful. So if you can do that on your project, I'd recommend it. Yeah?
Following a conversation I had earlier today, I was asked the question about, I think about accessibility, but do other capabilities within our organisation think about accessibility? So is it my responsibility to then teach them about it, or do you have, from your perspective, do you have that engagement from other departments that you work with, so if it's designers or other teams that you work with, are they all engaged in sort of accessibility as well as yourself? And who's that taught by? Is it the organisation or a specific team within software?
That's a really good question. I think within my team, I find that people are really willing to learn and to listen. So it's happened before that I've gone, okay, you've designed this and that's great, but have you thought about this problem with accessibility? And the design team always takes that on. I think there's more of a bit of a general problem, I would say, with being a consultancy in general, which means that every project figures out a great way to do something and they write it up in the documentation for their project, and that's all really well and grand, and when you join that project you can do that thing really well. But then when it comes to sharing that information across the organization, that doesn't often happen as well. So we're at the beginning stages now of sharing more of what we're learning, particularly with accessibility across the organization. And I think it is moving in the right direction, but I think a lot of the times the struggle is sort of moving away from siloed project-specific learning to sharing it more widely. Anyone else? don't believe so off the top of my. I'm not sure.
So if you've got like a 720 screen versus a 4K screen, and you did it like pixel to pixel, that touch size for all intents and purposes would be much smaller on the high density.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Curious, being curious.
I think in both the HIG and the Android guidelines it says if you use density pixels, I think on Android it's like 32 or 36, and on iOS it's 40 by 40. It sort of solves the problem for you.
Amazing, thank you. That's great. I didn't know that. Any more? Yeah.
It seems like a lot of the processes that you advocate for were like sort of, it's like once you've done your development, like in your PR template, have you thought about this, that, and this, and you talked about it's good to have that end of sprint or end of feature big accessibility review ticket. But have you had any like success or any joy with sort of trying to? I guess the question is like, how would you make that in like as early on in the process as possible, so that you rather than fixing a problem, you're like trying to think about them before you start doing this violent stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the things is whenever we learn something, so we throughout the project learn loads of new stuff about how all of this stuff works in React Native in particular, and we always share that knowledge. So whenever someone learns something interesting, they'd post on a Slack channel and go, "Hey, team, I've just learned about this thing," which I think helps because it's more on people's minds. Also, the more time you spend on a project hammering people over the head with, when you review a ticket, when you test your ticket, we'll be checking for accessibility, the more people really are just thinking about it throughout the process as well. Just because the people doing, for us, the people doing the reviewing and testing are also the developers. So people are testing each other's code. So because you're thinking about it when you're testing, you sort of end up thinking about it when you're developing. If you get enough tickets sent back where people are like, we didn't consider this as well, it takes time, I think, for people to pick up the habit and for people to think about it more. But what we found is the more you practice it, the more it becomes something that sticks in your mind a bit.
That makes sense.
It's not something I've read, but I've heard about this. I was wondering, have you used the accessibility info API as well?
Yes.
Because I mean, it might be a given. I mean, I will admit I'm fairly kind of new to accessibility within React Native, but it's. I was curious. I mean, how have you? Have you found it quite? Because I believe it's a relatively new thing within React Native, I believe, right? So it's we say it's been quite valuable on that front.
Yes, we've used it. I think for me, the fact that the accessibility documentation and the accessibility info documentation are separate really trips me up. But yeah, I think I found particularly, and I may be spoiling some workshop things here, but particularly announcing things for accessibility is really handy. So I think that's the feature of it that we've used the most, where if you think about an error occurring on the screen that just appears on your screen, for someone using a screen reader, they won't know about that unless they happen to manually navigate their screen reader to it. So if you use accessibility info, one of the things that you can do is announce things to the screen reader. So you can, whenever you detect a change that you know is going to visually happen, you can then trigger that change being read out by the screen reader as well. So stuff like that. It's a really useful API.
Thank you.
Cool. Any more? Yeah?
Have you looked at how we can measure the success of accessibility with customers and how you get that feedback, right? Because I suppose, like you were saying, in the web you can reach a standard and it's a bit more defined. You say a call something. From an app and website, how do we actually measure the success of the accessibility that we've implemented?
Some of it is the same process as web to me, in that when we had our accessibility audit, we were tested against WCAG, and so we got a huge PDF at the end where they said, you failed this WCAG requirement, or you partially met this WCAG requirement, stuff like that. So that is quite measurable. I counted by the number of problems people have found and the severity of them. Otherwise, I would say for us in our particular scenario, we didn't get as much of that, just because our feedback that we received for the app would just be seeing things like stakeholder reviews and reviews on the Apple Store and the Play Store. It is something that I'd be interested in getting a bit more exposure to, because I don't get as much feedback from actual users of accessibility technology as I would like to. Any more? All right.
What Luke was asking. One of the benefits they've got here at Sky is they have a visually impaired tester or blind not majority of that's what he's known by, isn't it, Harry? And we've used him in the squad that I've worked on. We've done some voiceover stuff on a small sort of bit of the application and used him sort of real time to test it, to validate the voiceover is working correctly. And it's brilliant because you have to explain to him, he can't see anything. So you kind of set the scene for him, set the context, and then get him to listen to the voiceover, and it's really valuable feedback.
That's really cool. You had a question as well, sorry.
I was wondering, with the screen orientation, that's one of the big challenges that we're currently facing. How do you avoid basically having to design two apps, two layouts?
That's a good question. I think some of it is doing minor layout changes. So we've had a few things where we've gone, the whole layout of the screen won't change, but this particular subcomponent might wrap where it previously wouldn't wrap, or might change from rows or columns just within here. Beyond that, I think my advice would be, sorry, you have to have two layouts.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any more? Yeah?
So, you've talked there about portrait and landscape.
Yep.
There's a number of Android phones now that are not of a static form factor, for want of a better word. We've now got flipped phones. We've got fold-out phones and things. I imagine accessibility is, I don't know, my impression would be that accessibility is yet another thing to design for in those kind of phones. I don't know, have you done anything like that? Have you got any advice, any gotchas or exploding buses in that area?
I wish I did. No, my answer, unfortunately, is that I've just not thought about flip phones at all. I think we maybe had a discussion about it at one point. I'll look it up and see if I come up with anything, but off the top of my head, I'm afraid not. But it is really interesting. It's a good point. What does a layout mean? What does landscape and portrait mean in that context? Any more? Yes?
Hello. So my question is about when you're testing for different types of impairments or challenges. So if you've got somebody that's, for example, a screen reader user and you want to add an extra hint or a label, but then you're comparing that with somebody who uses voice technology, so they'll talk and try to click a button. And I know that if there's a difference between the label in comparison to what they're saying, you come across some challenges. How do you build something that is accessible for everybody when there are so many different technologies that you can use with it, so many different requirements? How do you make that gauge of what's your golden standard?
Yeah, I think you just have to embrace that you're going to make some mistakes and continue learning. And that's, for us, we didn't think about keyboard testing at all, and we had loads of feedback about that. I think you're going to have to learn while doing it, unfortunately. I would say for labels and voiceover specifically, that tension is there and it is difficult. I think what you have to do is test on both when you're developing and see where the problem is, because I think usually your label should be close enough to the actual content of the button that it won't be a problem. But yeah, I don't know if that helps. Sorry, I feel like my answer is just...
There is no correct answer.
A lot of this stuff is more subjective than you like, isn't it? Any more? Yeah?
Accessibility is quite a big thing, but we also know AI is coming our way. Have you used AI at all to support you with accessibility?
Personally, no. There's more and more AI happening at Softwire. I think I can point you to a few people behind you who might have experienced it a little bit. Oh, was it accessibility? Was it AI powered? Ah, well, I can speak to that. I forgot it was AI. I did at one point, before getting started on all this, I tested a tool called Reveal, which is, it tests, I think it's iOS specific. It'll just scan through your app and find out accessibility issues, similar to Android Accessibility Scanner. It's a bit more difficult to set up, particularly if you're doing React Native, just because it expects some native iOS things, but you can just eject your project out of Expo and React Native and do that. It finds, in my experience, quite a lot of false positives. So it'll think things are not great contrast when actually it's just looking at something that isn't interactive or isn't meant to be. But it does find more in-depth things, so it spots a lot more than Android Accessibility Scanner would spot. And it also informs you on things beyond WCAG to just good practices and better ways to write labels and hints and that kind of thing. And that was AI powered. I forgot that it was, but it is.
At least partially. I'm sure there's parts of it that are not as well.
That would explain why it gave me so many false positives. Cool. Any more?
As I thought, so the newest, well, to be the newest iteration of the guidelines, or I guess W3Cs will be. Do you know? Yeah, I mean, I can't. Have they released like a rough timeline estimate for when those will be formally released? Out of curiosity.
So they've released. I think you can get a sneak peek, if you will, at some of the requirements. I think they've published a bit with the press generally. I would then say, if I'm remembering right, I think the first draft is meant to be November this year. I could be wrong, but that's the date I have in my head. And then it is only a first draft, so I think they're going to be working on that throughout the next couple of years. I think I'd expect the full version to be out in 2025, 2026.
It's good to know because I didn't know. Thank you.
No worries. Any more? It's generated way more discussion than I expected. That's very exciting. I was worried I just babbled on way too quickly and people couldn't catch up with me. All right, so a couple of other things. I've included some references at the end of here. One of them, like I say, is about keyboard testing and switch testing, some about WCAG free, and then we've got some things about contrast and also UI testing, but that's a web link. In doing research for this, one of the things that I found that was really interesting is automated testing for accessibility is actually way more mature in the web field. There's loads of really cool integrations with end-to-end test frameworks that will you can just go, and the screen doesn't have any accessibility issues, and that will just test the whole thing for you. So I've included a link to that if you do web and are interested. At the end of this, I have a couple of more slides with extra information. So if you're interested, grab me for a chat. I've put my email on the workshop as well, so you can find me really easily. Drop me a message. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. In terms of what we're doing now, so there's an interactive challenge. It is at this URL. If you don't have to participate, but if you'd like to, please get your laptop out. Yeah, have fun. We'll be here to help you. I doubt we'll get through the whole thing today, just because I got a bit overzealous with the amount of content I wanted to put into it. But yeah, again, my email is on there, so if you don't finish it today, but end up working on it and are interested and give me some feedback, I'd really love that. This is the first time that we're running this, so yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.